I love mysteries. Like, seriously, when I was younger, I had 3 jobs I wanted to be. I either wanted to be a photographer, a teacher, or a detective. I decided to drop being a teacher as I don't do too well with the caretaker aspect of it. I mean, I can hardly take care of myself. Photographer I kinda stuck with, which is now turning into something in a similar vein, being a graphic designer. But what I wanted the most was being a detective. When I was a little kid with a full head of hair, my dad and I would watch the shit out of CSI. Every episode we'd make it a tradition to watch and always compete in who could figure out who the murderer was first. I was so invested in this that one of the main reasons why I studied psychology was to learn about criminal psychology. I even started reading up on how DNA and RNA worked just so I could have that knowledge in case I'd ever need it. Unfortunately, due to personal reasons, I was not fit to become a detective, but that didn't diminish my adoration for solving mysteries and trying to solve cases. There's something about that feeling where things fall in place and everything connects that you just don't get anywhere else. You think I only follow Nightmind cause Nick is cool and I love horror? Well, there's that too, but also because this is essentially what Nick does. He takes a medium that's not your typical murder mystery and tries to make heads and tails of it. So, when I was suggested today's comic and found out I had the same opportunity to do just that, you best believe I jumped to it with gusto.
Do people still say gusto?
Today's comic is There's No Such Thing as Jason. This peculiarly named comic is a comic made by a person going by the name Fen for short, or phenylketonuroics if you're feeling spicy. The comic had its start in 2015 and was supposed to be just a one-shot character-driven piece for Fen's portfolio, but later extended into becoming its own beast of a comic. The comic is an amalgamation of Fen's interest and love for people and technology, and armed with a fine arts degree, they went on to put all their passions into the comic we're reviewing today, There's No Such Thing as Jason.
So let's see if we can solve the mystery on whether or not this comic is great and see just what exactly it means that there's no such thing as Jason! Yes, this will be a running joke.
This motherfucker right here. Oh, he wants to. Okay. Okay.
This is a weird one. There's a lot of factors in this. First of all, I asked for a comic suggestion and I was suggested this one by Cloudy, whom we all know and love. Cloudy suggested me Anarchy Dreamers back in the day, which is one of my favorite comics now, and I think of Cloudy as a brother. Guy's always been 100 with me and never steered me wrong, plus we tend to have the same taste and stuff. So when he suggested this comic, I was full on ready for it to be super good, but I don't know if I can honestly say I really enjoyed the comic, even though I can tell it's genuinely well made. I think the best way I can explain myself is by describing what the story is about. The comic starts out with us meeting Jason here, who has some issues with his computer. He's reluctant to go to tech support, but eventually goes despite being worried about bumping into a guy called Dim. Once there, he does bump into Dim, and the two have a little back and forth about how Dim didn't fix Jason's computer properly, and now Jason insists that Dim fixes it. The conversation, however, eventually devolves into Dim saying how he was the guy who gave Jason that blue eye, of which Jason has an oddly bright blue eye. Shortly after, Dim grabs a pen and seems to be about to stab Jason in the eye with it, and that's when the comic kinda changes. Suddenly we see the pen getting closer to the pupil of the eye that turns red and the pen blue, and the pen seems to distort and melt away as the eye becomes this big red ball. And then we see Dim bleeding profusely, screaming at a now red-haired Jason and calling him View, saying whatever dire stuff has happened is all View's fault. The flashback ends with Dim pulling a gun at View and screaming at him that there's no such thing as View. We then return to the present where Dim and Jason keeps talking, and we get some more flashbacks to where Dim mentions driving View somewhere. referring to view as you, meaning he's referring to Jason.
In other words, it seems very much by design that part of the comic's experience and its enjoyment you will get out of it comes from you trying to figure out what has happened and what is going on as the comic progresses.
The comic basically deals with Jason and the people around him trying to deal with the aftermath of a certain event that has happened. While Jason is trying his best just to find his way to live peacefully, despite his obsessive need of constantly being with other people, as well as having stuff happening around him, the comic also focuses on Dim and Day. Day is in a romantic relationship with Jason, although I'll be honest and say I've seen the same kind of chemistry between a vulture and a carcass, which I honestly think is on purpose. And as for Dim seems to try and figure out why what happened in the past happened, or dive further into what exactly is going on with Jason. Meanwhile, other characters also pop forth every now and again, and everyone seems to know fully well what's going on, while you as an audience don't.
I can honestly say I have never seen a comic quite like this before, and I believe I'll be hard pressed to find a comic like this in the future as well.
What I gave you earlier is but a snippet of what you can expect from the comic, and if this mindfuck sounds like a good time to you, then you're gonna have a blast with this comic. The comic is gonna take you all over the place. Suddenly there'll be extreme actions, people will talk about stuff you got no context or understanding of, they'll have flashbacks to things you don't know what is for the longest time, and the story will continue its natural course, expecting you to catch up sooner or later. Normally I'm all for not spoon-feeding your audience with information. I'm a strong believer that it should absolutely be left up to the audience to try and find their feet in a scene by the information you give them, rather than telling them where they are. But this comic is different. It makes it a habit of not telling you where you are, and whatever information it gives to you as to where you are in the scene will be turned on its head or twisted, leaving you to try again and again. Which there is no doubt in my mind is intentional. It's a comic that's akin to Marble Hornets on YouTube in that it's part of the experience to try and figure out what is going on. It's such a wildly different concept that it's fascinating, and I would almost go as far as say that it's genre defining, where it asks you to figure stuff out, effectively doubling your enjoyment with the comic as you're both enjoying the story that's happening as well as trying to piece things together to find out who View is, what happened in the past, and what are the characters dealing with in the now. Who's Sten? Why does he seem like such an elusive character? Why are Dim and Day at each other's throats? Like, you've been put in the middle of a story and now you have to figure stuff out. It's honest to God fascinating.
How many fingers am I holding behind my back? Did I misspeak just now? Did I actually mean to say how many fingers am I holding up behind my back? To have any frame to answer that question, you will first have to answer the other questions, being, did I misspeak? Or am I purposely trying to trick you? And that is the comic's biggest issue.
The main focus is about what law is and how we abide by it, as well as how it limits us. Jack operates as the neutral law, while Leo works as the more vigilante law. Together they find that Nikolai is the true villain as he serves his own law, and because of this they work together to stop him at the climax. Now, what did I just talk about? You don't know, do you? Now, I could keep talking about this topic and you'll be sat there left wondering what I'm talking about. You'll have theories and be on the lookout for keywords in what I'm saying to see if it fits in with a theory. And because of this, you might just miss out on what I'm actually saying. Until you know what I'm talking about, you don't know what to do with the information I'm giving you. As I keep giving you blocks of information, as long as you don't have a foundation to put the blocks on, they'll just fall. Sure, eventually I'll have given you enough blocks that you can make a new foundation out of it, but until then, all those blocks I gave you to begin with will be dropped, and you'll have to go back and pick them up again.
We obviously know that something has happened, but we actually don't know whether or not it's paranormal in nature. And that is because every time something paranormal happens in a comic, people don't really seem to care or even register it. Even the main characters, when something paranormal happens to them, will after the event return to the status quo. They won't address it, they won't talk about it, and it honestly just feels like all the paranormal stuff you're seeing is just effects for the sake that it's being a comic.
There's no such thing as
Jason!
It's a very mysterious comic. You're dropped right into the middle of things and you have to figure out your place within it. For more than 200 pages, your entire goal is trying to find rhyme and reason within the comics world. You get names, you get unique words, and as you try to connect the dots, all of a sudden you'll bang your head against a wall called fiction. By that I mean, normally when you have to solve a puzzle, you have rules and normalcy to work with. If I ask you what 2 plus 2 is, you're gonna give me a 4 cause that's how things are in the world. Well, what if it's now a fictional world and the plus means something completely different? What if you could change one of the numbers with magic? My very roundabout way of saying this aside, there's no such thing as Jason! We'll ever so often have these very dreamlike scenarios, typically happening around the main protagonist Jason. But we established somewhat early on that Jason's not all there. Or at least something is wrong. Alright, so it's him hallucinating. Fair enough. We'll also every now and again get flashbacks from frame to frame, which there isn't inherently anything wrong with, but okay, so sometimes what is going on is actually just a flashback. Fair enough. Now, let's take the art style, which is very colorful, very extreme, and very unique, and that's some very interesting framing and angles. And let's lastly at the part where sometimes the characters will be pictured in a made-up world or interacting with made-up objects because they are imagining or dreaming about stuff. Alright, now take all of that and then add it together, and what you end up with is a comic that begs you to try and figure something out. But for the longest time, you got no idea whether you're dealing with a comic that has paranormal elements in it, or it's a normal comic and it just uses hyperbole and artistry to showcase emotions and imaginations. Like in the comic A Guide to a Healthy Relationship, some of the characters will see things every now and again, such as monsters or evil eyes or something. But because the comic has long since established this is a real world, both with its writing and its art style, you know that when that stuff shows up, it's just in the character's head. But in There's No Such Thing as Jason, you got no clue. And you have no way of knowing for the longest time. And thus your brain, that's already scrambling to find out what's what, doesn't know how much agency to give each individual piece of information. You don't know what rules you're operating in. You don't know if you should bank your money on the fact that the character view is actually an inferior being, or if he's just a personification inside the character's head. There's No Such Thing as Jason! It's a comic I almost feel I should have pulled Nightman with me into, cause it's a comic that doesn't want to give you a linear story nor an easy experience. It starts a scene when it wants to, it ends a scene when it wants to, it jumps forward when it wants to, and many times you have to look for answers outside the comic and under it in the author's notes, and even those are sometimes cryptic or just straight up jokes. Several times I had it explain something that I didn't catch on the page, for example. While I don't doubt for a second that this is very much by design, that it wants you to struggle and try to come up with a coherent narrative, and it wants this endeavor to be part of the comic's experience, I still feel there are things within this that makes this more challenging than it should be, that I feel are not necessarily by design. There's something about the way that the characters communicate with one another that are sometimes overly cryptic or dramatized. And that wouldn't be a problem if that was all the time, so you realize that was the norm. But then you have characters also sometimes having very real and genuine conversations with one another, which just makes the cryptic conversations stand out more. There are also actions that characters that have acted like characters normally would suddenly take that seem strange. Like the character Day will at one point sit in her home and all of a sudden a cat, which she has never seen before, shows up in her home and she just goes, "Oh hi kitty," and doesn't do anything about it. Like she even addresses that it's not her cat and she's never seen it before, but she just lets it eat her brownie and then jumps into playing video games with her friend, ignoring the cat completely. Or, as I mentioned earlier, you'll have Dim who'll just straight up try and stab Jason in the eye with a pen, and it's just shrugged off. You also have Dim, who seems to be the one we have to go to get answers, but he's for some reason insistent in talking in almost exclusively metaphors, allegories, and purposely talking in that overly refined English, so a lot of the time, stuff just gets lost in conversations. And then you got the titular Jason, aka View, who sometimes seems like he knows what's going on, and other times he seems completely oblivious, and if you want to dissect the stuff he says for clues, then good luck. Cause the dude will never stop talking about everything. He'll talk about ice cream, the weather, phones, rabbits, you fucking name it. He'll just go into these huge conversations where he won't shut the fuck up about something. And that one, I will admit, is probably by design. And normally I'd like this, cause it shows he's a very talkative guy, and the comic even does a great job in showing it's him talking cause he's desperate to either make people like him or at least stay with him. But when you have to go through that with a fine-tooth comb to figure out if any of it has any legit meaning, it just becomes a long and annoying process.
It's like my ex would go into these long fucking talks about, so I met Jessica the other day, and when we met up, and oh my god, she had wore the nicest outfit, and we went out and we did some shopping, and then we went to get some food, and I had like this nice lasagna, and then we watched this movie with Jen, and he's so handsome. Anyway, what color were his shoes? And I'm just sat there going, but you didn't fucking tell me there was going to be a quiz!
There are also times where I feel the comic is talking over my head. It has a lot of babble about transmissions, proxies, wavelengths, relays, and despite being a nerd with a capital N, I several times lost track of what exactly they were talking about. And the biggest issue with that is that it seems to be related to View and Jason. And I know for a fact this isn't just supposed to be technobabble that's supposed to show some kind of massive understanding of technology that I know Fenn has, and some of it is supposed to be lost on you, as Fenn will every now and again explain what some stuff is underneath the comic, or talk about it like they expect you to have fully understood what was going on.
And I'll be honest, I didn't understand this stuff at all. Like, if only there was some place I could go where people could share their skills with me so I could understand it better. Wait a minute. Share? Skill? Share skill. Wait, no, that sounds retarded. Skillshare!
Let me tell you guys about Skillshare. Actually, I probably shouldn't have to, as millions of people have already made great use of this fantastic site. I reached out to these wonderful people and asked to become an affiliate because I knew this was something that could help you guys out. Do you, for example, want to learn how to make a sick logo for yourself? How about set up a web page for your webcomic? Maybe you would like some tips on color theory. Skillshare has all of that, curated by a bunch of professionals in the field. If you want to get your big brain on, you can use the link in the description and get 2 months for free off of your subscription, so you can try it out and see if there's something for you. This month, for example, I watched Writing Character-Driven Short Stories by Yi-Yun Lee, who you might have heard about, as she is the writer of the novel The Vagrants that won the gold medal in California Book Awards, and she had some of her thoughts and gave tips on how to best develop your characters, and what I really appreciated was how down to earth her language was, allowing everything from beginners to experienced writers to get something out of the class.
They may not have explained to me how radio frequencies work and whether or not they will be able to make a red-haired demon version of me appear. But I have learned how to make a sick-looking website, and if they do appear, then I guess I can make them one of those. For whatever fucking reason.
Now, it should be obvious by now that I got no idea where the comic is going, and while I might have some theories, I also had some theories 8 chapters ago that got disproven. I sincerely want to compliment Fenn for being so patient and adamant in the storytelling. It's not easy having a mystery like this and to keep it under wraps for so long without giving into its temptation and just blurt out what is what. That honestly takes some balls. Because when everything rides on what the reveal is, it's only human nature to wanna show it off. I've read 18 chapters, the amount that is currently out online as of writing this script, and while I'm more aware of what's going on, Finn has still not given up the ghost and told what the big reveal is. If anything, it's only gotten more complicated the further I've dived into the comic, which is really impressive. I guess I wouldn't mind getting some absolute certain answers every now and again. Not the big one, just some. I kinda feel, at this point, I've been strung along for long enough, and I would like some answers. I mean, there's enough mysteries and questions going around that I honestly feel like you could start answering just a little and raise even more questions. I feel when it comes to a comic like this, you wanna answer questions in almost a similar pace as you ask new ones. If the reader doesn't feel like they're going anywhere, then, well, they're gonna be bored, or even worse, frustrated. One of my absolute favorite games of all times is Yakuza 0, and when you're not throwing people around like ragdolls, going to phone sex clubs, hiring chickens to act as your real estate agents, and helping Michael Jackson moonwalk down Shinjuku while protecting him from zombies, these are all things by the way, trust me. The game, just as much as any other game in the series, tells a very complicated story complete with twists and turns at every corner. Yakuza is famous for its insanely detailed and intricate plots, and the way it manages to keep you invested is that every time you get one answer, it raises more questions. Like, oh shit, a guy died and you're framed for the murder. Who framed you? Oh, okay, your own clan did. But why? Oh, they did it because they wanted you out of the clan. Oh, okay. But why? Like, it keeps going like this, so you always feel like you can catch up. And even when you're hopelessly confused where the plot is going, it still gives you something to go for.
Getting a solution to a problem and an answer to a question gives it that nice little punch of endorphins that we love on a subconscious level. So when it's being held outside of our reach on purpose, it's frustrating. Yakuza understands this, and so it sets up a big question at the beginning that will only get answered at the end, sure, but between those 2 points, it gives us plenty of small little aha moments to keep us invested and going.
I feel there's no such thing as Tazer to benefit from this. The very same questions it asks at the beginning are still questions we have now, and while we may have theories, we don't know if they're true or not, and they're the best we have to go with. Not a single question has been definitively answered, and I honestly feel that I, as a reader, don't have a place to firmly dig my fingers into and grab a hold, all while more and more questions keeps being piled on top of me.
Like, at this point, I don't even know what direction to go. That's how little I know. It's like, maybe it's this way. Or maybe it's this way. Maybe it's upwards. Maybe it's in the ground. Who knows? I'm crazy.
So, when it comes to this comic's writing, what do I think? Well, honestly, I wasn't too keen on it. I don't really feel it clicked with me. Maybe I was reading it wrong, I don't know. I guess maybe I expected a little more. I can definitely tell you with absolute certainty that there's no point during your reading of this comic that you'll be bored. And there's a lot of just constant oddities and mystery happening to keep you invested. I blew through this comic and its pacing was honestly super good, if not pretty confusing at times. It manages to juggle its flashbacks really well and natural in a way where it almost feels just like how a memory works, with it suddenly popping up when the characters are reminded of something, and just as fast as it is introduced, just as quickly will it disappear when people are being snapped out of their daydreaming. It works really well in fact. I know I pissed and moaned, but there are a lot of great stuff about this comic. There's also a very real and very possible chance that I simply just didn't get the story. And you're hearing me giving this critique now will just go, is he as dumb as he looks? It's obviously so and so. But there's just something about how the mystery is handled that doesn't sit well with me. When making a mystery, to me, you have to be so freaking careful that the reader knows the exact amount of information at any given time to get the optimal experience. No more, no less. And if they're supposed to know something that's not true, the same rules applies with that. But there's just so many small things that give you these theories rather than facts. Is Dim a sociopath for out of nowhere trying to stab Jason in the eye? Or is it just weird in-jokes or bad writing? Is Day a ditzy scatterbrain for not questioning how a cat just found its way into her house? Or does this happen regularly? Or is it bad writing? Like, I know these sound like minor points, but I need to know what is deliberate by the author and what comes as a result of bad writing. And if you're not cashing out on any of these things that may be conceived as bad writing and prove it was deliberate, then it's hard not to think it can be bad writing. And as such, it brings everything I thought I knew into question. In short, there's a lot of stuff going for this comic, and Fenn is a great writer, but in my experience, they're not necessarily great at this particular genre. Fenn is great when it comes to characters talking, double entendres, pacing, and especially setting a scene and a mood, like you'll find few people better at that than them if I may be frank. But mystery like this? Honestly? No.
I'm being very harsh, especially considering that there's a very real chance that I just didn't get it. Judging by friends and peers who seem to love the comic, there's a very real chance that this comic just didn't click with me.
Let me just come out and say it, if you liked Anarchy Dreamer's art, you're gonna like There's No Such Thing as Jason's art too. Cause holy shit do they share a lot of elements. There's No Such Thing as Jason is extremely colorful, and I simply adore the concept of having very fashionable clothes and aesthetics presented in such a different and artsy style. The proportions are exaggerated almost like in One Piece, and the colors are vibrant and strong. Each single frame is detailed to hell and back, filled with different elements, and each scene is thoroughly established on frame 1. This is one of the reasons why the flashbacks work so well, because with how detailed the scenes are, you are never in any doubt when you are switched locations, because everything seems to fit in each scene.
I, with capital F, fucking love Fenn's art style. Let me just get that out there.
The art style also really just aids the extreme and potential paranormal stuff going on in the comic. There's a lot of really cool and different designs, but despite the busy and exaggerated look of the comic's characters, you're never at any point doubting who's who. Even when we see View, whose entire body language and visual style is vastly different from Jason's, you are at no point doubting that it's Jason's body. Also, I just love Jason's hoodie. There's something about the crimson red hoodie fitted on top of such a meek and unconfident character that makes for an interesting contrast. And there's no doubt in my mind that Fenn knows what they're doing with the colors and fashion they give people, as they seem to purposely give Dim, the boring and moody character, very dark colored clothes with little to no design, fitting his pragmatic and stale personality.
And the best thing is that it's always consistent with the characters, really nailing home that this was a conscious decision.
Now, there's a lot to be said about how this comic presents itself. Some good, some bad, and some pretty bad. Now, as stated before, the pace of this comic is great. Fenn's typesetting is on point. Even when there's no real actions ever taken, it's almost all dialogue most of the time. It never felt boring because Fenn understands to part voice bubbles up, so you get your room to breathe between voice bubbles. I couldn't find any actual source for this within comics, but if you want to learn how this stuff works, believe it or not, read up on UX design, as it operates under the same rules, parting up information to make it more manageable to read. Fen does this masterfully, and if you want to look into how to part up your text frames and bubbles, look at this comic for inspiration.
Fen proves that you can actually have a lot of text on your page without it seeming like a slog to work your way through.
As for the framing, however, this is where it gets a little iffy. When you look at some of these pages, you really get a sense that a lot of stuff is going on. It almost feels like the scene is chaotic and there's 1,000,002 things happening all at once, but it's really just two guys talking about computers. And the reason for that is that Fen does not use the gutter. Like at all. Everything is shown. And to cram all that information into one page, you get a lot of small frames that don't really add anything. Like on this page here, we see Jason digging out his computer, putting it on the table, clicking something, and then turning the power on before talking to Dim. Those 3 frames here are completely redundant. Like, we don't need to see Jason actually turning on the computer when we know his intent and he's even saying it's about to be up and running. This is primarily an issue with the earlier pages where Fen wants to squeeze as much into a page as humanly possible rather than spreading it out over multiple pages. As stated before, this is something Fen learns to improve as the comic goes on. But even in the latter pages, it feels like characters are almost fighting for space on the pages, and everyone will be presented in a frame they hardly seem to fit in. It doesn't help that almost all voice bubbles are jammed against the sides and the corners of the frame that gives the comic a feeling of being really condensed. It's time for me to dig out my actual graphic design degree and act like I know something. In composition, there are things known as open and closed composition. And for some reason, everyone gets these wrong, so let me just put it to bed real quick. A closed composition is when the subject you want to draw attention to is all within the borders of the frame, and an open composition is when it spans outside the frame. I don't know how people keep getting this wrong, but here we are. Anyway, a closed composition like this makes it easy for the audience to immediately tell what to focus on, and every other element helps drawing our attention to that. It makes it easy, and thus less taxing, for us as an audience to enjoy what we're looking at. An open composition, on the other hand, is, as you might have guessed, the opposite. There's not one thing to focus on, and it feels more like you've captured an image of something in motion. Because you got no idea what's outside the borders of the frame, your mind is left to try and fill out the gaps, which it instinctively will. That's why this technique is so often used for shots of, say, fields or canyons. Because you're not supposed to be focusing on one thing, you're supposed to imagine the greater expanse of the landscape that's pictured. In other words, this one takes some imagining and some brain processing. And if we return to the comic when so many frames are so close and not really focusing on anything in particular, we're dealing with open compositions, which in turn makes us use brain processing on each single frame. And if we do that while we move on quickly, thanks to the great usage of parting voice bubbles up all over the page, we are essentially being told to stop and think about a frame while at the same time being rushed through the comic, which stresses the brain out. The Nobel Memorial Prize winner of Economic Science, Daniel Kahneman, published a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, in which he described 2 systems. This is something fighting game players all know, maybe without knowing the word for it. The 2 systems, dubbed System 1 and System 2, are different ways your brain thinks. System 1 is the fast, instinctive, and emotional way of thinking. It's what you use to calculate 2 plus 2 and what you use to throw a punch in a fighting game. It's just pressing a button. System 2 is the slower, more deliberate and logical way of thinking. It's what you use to solve hard math problems, and what normal people like me use to do the Raging Demon. In other words, you can over time turn a System 2 action into a System 1 action, much like how when you started out using your computer, you'd look where you type, and now you don't have to look at the keyboard anymore. The same thing goes for open and closed compositions, and it's actually been proven that when using System 2 thinking, you're actually draining yourself, cause not only does your muscles tense up a little, your pupils dilate a little more, and your heart rate increases. This is one of the many things a lie detector measures, for example. In other words, the comic is encouraging you to use the System 2 way of thinking because so many of its frames are open compositions, which makes your brain, on a subconscious level, wanting to complete the picture. But that clashes because the comic is made so well that you're using System 1 to just read through it real fast. So it's constantly asking you to stop, move fast, stop, move fast, stop, move fast.
In summary, the comic uses two different elements that are so wildly different and used so frequently that your brain is forced to operate under two different systems constantly going back and forth, which stresses the brain out and makes stuff that shouldn't be confusing, because your brain is scrambling.
As great as the designs are, as well colored and shaded it is, and as much as I adore Fenn's art style, which I really fucking do, the presentation is definitely where this comic fucks you. The mildest offenders being stuff where I will come up short when I'm trying to analyze a scene, such as this one here where the frame will be broken up by the side view of Jason's laptop and phone. Like, Jason and Dim are hugging, it seems like they're having a moment of closeness, but I interrupted and brought out of the magic of the moment when Jason gets a phone call, and Dim seems to be knocked out of the shock and thus pushes Jason away. Then why is it framed like this? Like, why is the laptop separating the two frames of Jason and Dim when it was the laptop that brought them together? The background is even the same, so using the theory of Gestalt, I got a whole video about that you should check out, we know these two belong together. Why is the divide caused by the computer not the moment Dim reacts to being knocked out of his shock? If anything, the scene continues unhindered and Dim pushes Jason away in a completely separate frame. And lastly, why is the computer the thing dividing the frame and not the phone? It's the phone that's ringing. The laptop is just what the phone is pushed up against. Heck, you might as well put some gum and pencils in there somewhere too if we're including things that are just near the phone. Stuff like these are not few and far between in this comic, and just like the unnecessary frames that I mentioned before, they're very frequent at the beginning and less so, but not gone, in the later strips. This honestly just feels like Fenn wanted to have something unique and different to part up the frames, use that fine arts degree for something, but to people like me, it kinda tells me don't analyze stuff like this. It wasn't a conscious decision. But then later, there will be conscious decisions like Tile waking up Cress, and we see the frame here between the sleeping Cress and the awake Cress, and along with the distorted lettering coming into focus, we're able to tell that this is the moment Cress wakes up. So Fenn does know how to do this right. But I've already been told at the beginning of the comic not to read too much into it. So again, like I mentioned with the writing, I don't know what I should put agency into and what I shouldn't.
Because visual storytelling is something you only really get the full benefit of if you sit down and analyze it, it is so vital that every time you use it, it's a conscious decision and you know exactly what you're doing. If at any point you think, I'll just style it a little bit, and your audience will think that that's visual storytelling, it brings every time you use visual storytelling into question. Because then suddenly, why should I give agency to that and not into this?
I mentioned how those analyzing the scene things here were the mildest offenders, and now it's time to talk about the most severe offenders. the Smash Brother offenders, if you will, of ruining my reading experience of this comic. That offender is how the comic's style actively hurts the comic's conveyance. So many times, due to the comic's presentation, I was left with false negatives and pondering over things I probably shouldn't be pondering over. One of the biggest issues I remember having is that View's primary color is crimson red, and every now and again when the comic is about him or View pops up, there'll be red discolorations in the scene, sometimes with highlights showing up as red, or just straight up red orbs and particles hanging around in the air. And this is the exact same red color used for blood in the comic, and many times I was left wondering if characters were actually bleeding or if it was something to do with View. The art is also just straight up unreliable at times, and due to the nature of the comic, I don't know whether that's on purpose or it's straight up a mistake. Like almost all of chapter 7, which is a confrontation between Dim and Jason, where we see Dim get called to the front of the store cause Jason is there with a computer. And we get to see Dim grab the computer, work on it, hand it back, and then have a verbal fight with Jason and then piecing out. And then we hear some guy say he was in a pretty serious phone call. Like, motherfucker, what? Okay, let me pretend this was all a visual representation of how their phone call went, and they weren't communicating face to face, but rather over the phone. Jason still handed his laptop to Dim, and Dim worked on the fucking thing and handed it back. Okay, so that doesn't work. Maybe it was all in Dim's head. Maybe it was a flashback. That doesn't work either, cause while having the talk with him, it both goes into a flashback and one of those scenarios where you don't know whether it's paranormal or not, and then back again. And just a quick aside now that we're talking about this, the reason why I don't know whether or not the paranormal actually happens or not is that no one seems to react to the paranormal stuff taking place. Just wanted to get that out there. But yeah, if this was indeed Dim imagining things, there's way too much stuff going on to make that understandable. And lastly, the whole fucking thing starts out with Dim being told there's someone who needs him on the floor, meaning Jason does show up in person. So what the fuck? I remember when reading this, I had to read the chapter like 4 times, wondering if I had missed something or misunderstood something, and to this day, I still can't tell what the fuck the deal is. And this isn't the only time where the comic's presentation just fucked me. There'll be all these effects and comicsy ways to show something, and you're in constant doubt whether it happens in universe or just because it's a comic. Like, there's this one time where apparently young Jason's hair will glow bright red, and for the longest time I didn't know that was the case because I thought it was one of the red particles I've seen floating around so often. Like, there was nothing in the comic that told me this was an actual in-universe glow and not just yet another comic effect. There's also this one page, this one single page among all the pages of this comic that's animated. And it's a bunch of rings opening and closing. This is a really cool effect and it fits really well with a comic such as this. Almost like the ghosts in Unsounded that would be hanging around the comic's frames, gives this feeling of not belonging in the comics universe. Why not do more of those? Like on this page here, why not have the screens flicker between the different symbols? Why is it only this one page?
Phil, you make me angry, Phil! Could've just grabbed one of these, Phil!
There's also just something with the presentation where I almost felt like Finn was just flexing. And you know, do flex. I don't mind people flexing when they actually do have an ability worth flexing. Finn is extremely talented in their art, and they show that by not 1 or 2 panels being the same. And you get all of these different angles and views and close-ups, and that's all good stuff, but at the same time, why? Like here, why frame it like this? Why have the soda in the foreground like that? Why hide Day's face when we already know it's her talking from the previous frame and the immediately following frame? Why are you using a Dutch angle here? Why show this close-up of the cat with what almost feels like a fish-eye lens effect when the topic isn't even about the cat? Again, if it was just for flavor, I could understand it. But we also see times where Finn knows to use the angles to their advantage to convey a feeling or message. Like in this frame here, where the girl is looking at the coffee mugs. We can tell she's paying attention to them because they're in the foreground and she's looking at them. The Dutch angle gives us an uneasy feeling, telling us that she has some sort of plan with them. Like there are times where Finn is so much above every other comic in terms of its presentation, because they understand how to use angles and shit right, but because there's just as many, if not more times where it's used wrong, it feels like one of those things where even a broken clock is right twice a day. And unfortunately for Finn, due to the comic being what it is, it further highlights and infuriates me when I don't know what's on purpose and what's a mistake.
I'm all for spicing your art up and use different angles to keep things interesting. In fact, I adore it. But with a comic like this, where the audience is actively tasked to find rhyme and reason, to analyze every scene, you cannot just put stuff in there for the sake of it looking cool. Cause then we as an audience will sometimes look at that and go, maybe there's meaning behind it. Maybe we should take that into consideration as well. When honestly, we shouldn't, and thus we are led on a wild goose chase.
Ultimately, there's so much to love about Finn's art. The conveyance, the effects, the character designs and the use of color are all fantastic. But at the same time, the conveyance, the effects, the framing and presentation is also its biggest issue. It's a comic that feels like it's flip-flopping between the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. When it works, holy shit does it work. And when it doesn't work, holy shit does it not work.
Sometimes it's like anal sex and it's like, fuck yeah! And other times it's like anal sex and it's like, but hey, in the end, it's still anal sex.
Now, I know what you might be wondering. Which one is most prominent? Well, you'll be happy to know, for the most part, the presentation of this comic is super solid. It takes some time to get out of the gates at the beginning, but once it's out, it's going and it's going hard. I'm also not above admitting a lot of these issues that I'm having are issues the average viewer probably won't have. My job is to go and dissect stuff, and thus I pick up on things that weren't supposed to be dissected, whereas the average reader will go through the comic and probably only dissect stuff Finn wants people to dissect. In other words, I don't think you will have the same flip-flopping experience I had. And that's not to put myself on some sort of pedestal and talk about how good I am, because no one hates me more than myself. I just think this is one of those comics that, much like Anarchy Reigns, which by the way is the plot I summed up earlier, that you should just enjoy, because once you start analyzing it, you'll realize that a lot of it doesn't really work.
So really, and I'm not even trying to be an asshole here, if you want to enjoy this comic, just shut up and enjoy the ride.
You see, the problem is that I actually really like these characters. I like them because they don't show their entire hand right away. For a comic all about mystery and secret agendas, what a genius idea it is to make it so that the characters are also ambiguous in what their goals are and why they act like they do. Are people on Jason's side, or are they working against him? And if so, how and why? Like, these are questions we constantly get bombarded with, and it's one of those things I don't mind having to question, as it's the nature of people to have many different sides and us bystanders not knowing what their end goal is. Humans are the most complicated thing in the world, and so to give them that role and play on that doubt, it's a stroke of genius to have it be on the forefront of everything. But, just like the rest of the comic, it slips at the start line. Like if you read all of the comic at this point, you would probably think that Jason is overly crazy about getting back on good footing with Dim, right? I say that because Jason is using every opportunity he gets to be together with Dim, or just talk with him, to the point where he actively lies about stuff being wrong with his computer just so he can have Dim take a look at it, right? And he's so afraid of losing Dim as a friend that he's agreeing to everything Dim says and tries to find common ground with him in every statement that Dim makes. Alright, now try and read the beginning of the comic. Here Jason doesn't want to meet with Dim, he's actively avoiding him. He gives him lip, he cusses him out, and is prone to outbursts with him and shitting on him. All of that is swept under the rug as the comic goes on, and Jason just ceases to be what we saw him as in the beginning. And it's so sudden that I refuse to believe it's character growth. It's also not because he just met Dim after so long, when we know from their first conversation that they have met before. Heck, Jason specifically has issues with Dim because Dim allegedly didn't fix his computer correctly the first time. And we also see he's not making up an excuse to come see Dim at the beginning by us seeing him legit struggling with his computer. We also hear how Jason is adamant on getting to finish his paper and caring about school. But later on, he doesn't give a damn about school and cuts almost every class that he can.
And it's so weird because this massive change happens in what feels like a single day in the comics universe.
It's just so weird. And it's extra weird because Jason is our main protagonist. He's the titular character. He's the one that has paranormal stuff, stuff happening to. He's the one we are observing most closely. So why is he the one that's changing around the most like this? And just like everything else, because we're left to put pieces together and theory craft, the question becomes, maybe it's on purpose, maybe it's not. Maybe Jason does change personality. But if that's the case, this is so terribly done. Nothing is done to show this change. Heck, Dim, who's always incredibly adamant in speaking his mind, at no point mentions how Jason is acting different. It legit just feels like Finn realized Jason better fit whatever his character became down the road and changed Jason to that, rather than what he was at the beginning. It feels like a change made behind the scenes rather than on the scene, if that makes any sense. And it's extra difficult to determine here when you're dealing with characters who can change, but again, it's too sudden and off-screen that I honestly refuse to believe it's a character growth or decline. And even if it was, fuck, is that a terrible change from 0 to 100 in such a short span of time. It's such a crying shame because, again, there's a lot of great stuff about Jason. I think he's annoying and it's hard to tell what he's up to and what he's thinking. He's eccentric and strange kind of guy who'll put salt in his soda like some kind of fucking psychopath. And all of these things here I can tell are by design. I especially love how he'd do everything in his power to be with someone. Without stating it outright, it became evident very fast that Jason is afraid of being alone, and even more so, alone in his college dorm room, as he'd rather opt to sleep in his car. See, there are things I love, cause while I may not know the reason for his phobia, I can tell the warning signs, cause there's so many consistent warning signs pointing towards the same thing. For once, there's consistent material to base legit conclusions on, and I really liked when the comic finally gave those to me. I feel the comic could do with much more of that.
When the comic really gave me something to grab a firm hold of and dive into, That was when the comic really felt like it was all coming together, and that was a great feeling.
Dim is probably the most straightforward of the characters, and even that is being incredibly generous with the words straightforward. If anything, maybe the best word to use is honest. Dim clearly had something to do with Jason when View first became a factor, and it's clear that even though in the flashback he seems aloof at best, that Dim and Jason used to be really good friends. Perhaps because of this, Dim seems to be the one who knows the most about what's going on and seems to be scheming something in the background. However, just because he's honest doesn't mean that you can rely on him for information, as he will constantly talk in riddles and double entendres. I don't necessarily mind that, as it's a good way of keeping the mystery alive even when you have a character that seemingly knows everything so front and center. Although I will say, I have yet, in all my 31 years alive on this planet, seen anyone talk like this before. And frankly, if they did, I would probably punch them in the mouth. It does kinda tiptoe on the edges of being a little too much for believability, but with everything else going on, I'm willing to give it a pass. It should also be stated, no, I do not know why he's suddenly turning into a Swiss Army knife man at some points and has all those things poking out of his back. And for that matter, I don't even know if it's a real thing or not. Also, he too seems to have this odd thing where he'll dump a lollipop in his coffee.
I'm pretty sure that's a hate crime.
Day is... Okay, before any of that, let me just real quick mention how I had the toughest time with these names. The reason for that being, I have never heard these names before. It wasn't until I heard that Dim was a shortening of Dimitri that I could understand it, but Day's legit just called Day, and I've never heard that as a name before. So whenever she was brought up in the beginning of the comic, I was so hopelessly confused, because I thought the characters were talking about a day, like a date. And for the longest time, I thought they were referring to the day where everything with Jason and View went wrong, but nope. Day's apparently a name, so I'm an idiot. Day is weird. She's both one of the most interesting characters in the comic, yet she feels more or less like an afterthought in certain areas. Like, some of the stuff I love about her is again her ambiguity, especially when it comes to her relationship with Jason. I legit do not know if she's for real fancies Jason, or if she's just with him to keep an eye on him. I don't know if her talking about a game where you count people's teeth is supposed to be endearing, or it's supposed to be a random, quickly made up thing just for the sake of having something to talk with Jason about. It's extra interesting because she seems to flip-flop between playing the tempting seductress who enables everything Jason does, while at the same time seems to strong-arm him into doing what she wants. It's also clear she doesn't necessarily have Jason's best interests in mind, as she doesn't seem to care when Jason is cutting school to talk to her or hang out with her. Where she feels like an afterthought, however, are times where stuff that by all means have no right being as little explained as it is, are just glossed over. Like a moment where she cusses her boss out, screams at her, and has to be bailed out by Tyler, who just happens to show up and says they'll be right back. Nothing is done with this afterwards. Like, how did the conflict go with the boss? She's still keeping her job, so she clearly didn't get fired, even though her boss seemed more than interested in firing her ass right then and there. There's also a time where Tyler shows up and screams at Dave for hanging out with Jason, yet without even as much as acknowledging that event happening, she's right back to seeing Jason afterwards. In other words, Day seems really important to the story, but the stuff that happens around her doesn't seem to be given any agency. It just has to happen for the sake of the plot moving forward, without us getting to experience how Day deals with the situation.
I swear, it feels like there's more time spent on explaining why Day can eat a burger the size of her own head than the precautions of her cussing out her own boss.
There are a few other characters, some of which are more interesting than others. Characters such as Tyler honestly just seems to be there for the sake of dating Chris to bridge Jason and Dim's families together. Like, I honestly don't know what his character brings to the table. He seems really confident and self-secure, but as far as what he brings to the overall conversation, I got no idea. Chris, on the other hand, seems to have something to do with the whole thing and seems to know much more than she leads on. I personally really liked her character, although her inclusion has been rather minimal. She seems to act like the typical big sister role, but there's something about her choice of words that makes her feel almost scary sometimes. I think Chris is one of the characters who really feels like she fits into this mysterious tone the best, but I can't really describe why. And lastly, there's Sven. Sven's clearly the one who knows the most, if not the one who orchestrated everything this comic deals with. If the comic has an evil scientist villain, I'm sure he's the one. I really like the mystery that surrounds him, and him wearing sunglasses to hide just a teeny tiny bit more of his face is perfect to shroud his character in mystery. I will say, I think I could stand to see a little more of him. Like, I know he's doing stuff behind the scenes, but I keep forgetting he's even a thing. I think he could stand to show up a little more often, maybe antagonize the characters a little, or just show up in the background. He doesn't have to say much or anything really, just let me know he exists, you know? It's like if I mention, yo, do you remember Hoyt in Far Cry 3? You'll probably not know who I'm talking about, even if he's the actual last boss of the game. But people tend to not remember him because he hardly ever showed up, and Vas, whose view in this comparison, was just so much more interesting that you had no reason to remember Hoyt.
Okay, small correction, I wasn't even trying to be funny here. His name is actually Steen, not Sven, but because he shows up so little in the comic, I couldn't remember it, so I guess it just proved my own point now, didn't I?
Ultimately, the characters, with a few slip-ups excluded, are definitely the strongest part of this comic. Fenn manages to grab exactly what makes characters interesting, which is giving them layers and making them complicated like humans are supposed to be. It's interesting to see these characters interact with one another, as well as seeing what persona they choose to wear in what situations. It's also definitely from their behavior that you learn the most about the story. While I didn't exactly enjoy the comic as much as I had hoped, I definitely enjoyed the characters. Even Dim has a lot of elements I normally don't like, and I ended up thoroughly enjoying him as a character.
I always like to say that when you can make me like something I normally wouldn't like, you have done a remarkable job, and that deserves all the praise in the world.
The writing is a 6. I honestly can't say I like the writing as much as I like the idea of the writing. The premise and the concept itself was what kept me going, but I legit think the writing didn't help the concept at all. The art is a 7. I love the art, I love the colors, and I love that Fenn every so often uses visual storytelling to their benefit. But when the art actively hindered the enjoyment of the comic and made stuff confusing when it shouldn't be, I honestly can't give it a higher score. The characters are a 7. As I said, this is what you should read the comic for. The characters are very human, even if their circumstances are not. There's a lot of things other aspiring writers can take away from this comic when it comes to character writing. All in all, there's no such thing as Jason is a 7. I can't say I had a bad reading experience here, even though I have bitched a lot about it. I applaud the concept, and like I said, many of my issues come from me reading it as a reviewer. It's not a flawless comic in any way, but when it works, it works.
I know I've been pissing and moaning for the better part of, an hour now? But honestly, go read There's No Such Thing as Jason. I may have had the comic hyped up a little too much for me, and I'm also sometimes a little too analytical for my own good. So maybe you will have a much better experience with this comic than I did. Also, it should be said, having talked with Finn, they are an amazing person. They really helped with the production of this video. From everything from sending me an entire Google document about the history and the development of this comic, as well as sending me a PDF with the entire comic so I could just rip it from that rather than the website. That really helped this production a lot. So really, they deserve a lot of love, and I hope you guys will give that to them. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next Webcomic Relief. Take care.
Hello. Thank you for watching my pretty long video here. I decided to throw the list that I have of all the different comics that I need to review out of the window and instead just talk with you guys on Twitter about which comics you wanted. So thank you for suggesting There's No Such Thing as Jason, and thank you once again to Finn for their amazing support in supplying everything I needed for this video. It really made the process a whole lot easier, which I'm thankful for, because everything else decided to make it as an annoying process as humanly possible. Somehow, don't know how, I managed to delete the script. Or well, I thought I deleted the script. It was actually just thrown into a different folder. And that happened like halfway through. So that was fun. I also realized that I recorded all of the audio with a wrong setting. So if the audio of this episode sounds a little wonky, that'll be why. There's also just been a bunch of small little things, but ultimately it's not been the most flawless review I've ever done, but I still had a lot of fun with it, and I hope that comes through. I tried some new things in terms of presenting what I'm talking about and shit, and also just keep flexing those animation and After Effects skills and just try my way around with that because it's so much fun, which again is only possible for me to do thanks to all of you lovely people who helped me get a new computer. Again, it is running like butter and I cannot thank you guys enough. As for news, there's not really a whole lot. I hope you like the new credit sequence, and this also looks different in case it's not obvious. I don't know how much more I will change, or if there's stuff that I should change. If there's stuff you think could do with an update, let me know and I'll see what I can do. But for now, I just want to talk about the amazing people who has helped backing me up on Patreon so that I can put food on my table during these times where I am still in school. So let's talk about the amazing people who helped sponsoring this episode. Luke McKay. Luke McKay, that we all know and love from his Rooster Teeth comics and Boss to Dad, is currently working on comics for DnD Beyond and has now taken over doing comics for the Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms game at codenameentertainment.com. So check that out if you like any of his previous work. Nana Newcomb. Nana is working on a comic called 6 Months, which is a romantic comic of a detective who falls in love with the superhero of the city. If you've been paying attention, you'll notice that Nana has been a long-time supporter of the Webcomic Relief, and my god can you tell she's improved in that time. So please, go check out 6 Months. Wyanutwarrior. Wyanutwarrior wants me to push the webcomic known as Hope. The comic is about superheroes that gets into trouble and who has to save the universe from an evil empire known only as Spade. When a young girl Raylin gets targeted by this evil empire, she joins forces with her friends to take them down and save the galaxy. So check it out. I'm a Moron. For this Patreon pledge, Moron told me that Cloudy told him to tell the people, that is you, at the end of this video that this spot was sponsored by the Anarchy Dreamers by Emily Ree. In case you've been living under a rock and haven't heard, Anarchy Dreamers is one of the most ambitious webcomics of 2020 and it's totally free to read. Currently being read by thousands of users, and it's one of the most impressive comics in its class with detailed characters and a diverse, all-encompassing cast. And while you're at it, come over and buy stylish, handmade merchandise by Moron himself. And remember, caring is punk. The Bonsai. The Bonsai has still not gotten back to me about what he wants me to push, so just know he's an awesome and super talented guy. And be on the lookout for when he finally drops what he's working on, because it will be well worth the wait, I am sure of it. Hugo Junstrand. When he's not making my super awesome title cards, Hugo is also making super sick animations that you can commission, as well as sick music that you can all find on his YouTube channel. If you wanna listen to awesome music covers with stylish and unique animations to them, then swing by Hugo's channel and give him a sub. Sebastian Vandborg. Sebastian wants me to push the Twitter account Curious Zelda, which has a rich plethora of cute and funny cat images. He doesn't own the account or anything, but he just likes cats, so there you go. Emotion. Emotion is currently running a Kickstarter for some sick animal pins of the cast of their comic Druids. With more than 30 days left of the Kickstarter, they've already made their way halfway through their goal. Donate as little as $8 and you can get surprise animal pins to show your support for the comic. The link will be in the description. Soulblader. Soulblader has still yet to get back to me about what it is he's currently working on, but like I said in my last video, knowing him is probably gonna be something super awesome, so please get ready to support him once he finally comes out with his project. And of course, let's not forget to mention all these lovely people. Naoto Kamigiri Terumi, Nina Ha, Graham Herring, Hitori the Artist, Cage Vafiel, Loraya-kun, Drake of Adrian, and Shiv. And of course, also a huge thank you to the lovely people that you see on screen right now. If you want to support the show, there's a ton of different ways you can go about it. You can use the link in the description and get those 2 months off of your Skillshare subscription, which I highly encourage. You can also buy some Webcomic Relief t-shirts, or you can hop in on Patreon and pledge any amount of money that you want to pay every month, and as a result, you can get rewards from shoutouts, product plugs, early access to videos, and even one-on-one coaching with me. All of these links will be in the description. If you don't want to support the show financially, please think about liking the video, commenting on the video, share the video with your friends, and of course remember to subscribe with that bell thingy turned on. You know, cause I cuss a lot, so YouTube doesn't want to show off my videos. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Hellraiser, and also drop by my Twitch channel Riser Plays, where I every now and again stream video games and analyze them, or just talk a bunch of dumb stuff. I'll see you guys at the next Webcomic Relief. Take care.